ליאורה, את רוצה להתחיל לפני שהיא מצטרפת?
Okay. Hi everybody. Geshe is not here yet, so I'm happy to welcome you. Great to see you all. Just like to remind you that if you have questions for Geshe, please write them to Dalit. She will mail it. She will forward it to Geshe. Geshe is here, so נעלמה לי. Hello Geshe.
Hi, hello.
And hello everybody again. Good to see you. And just would like to remind you again that if you like to express your generosity, the Dalit will send us the details how to donate your dana. After expenses, we donate everything to the teacher, and this is our way to show our appreciation. For the teachings, thank you, Geshe. We appreciate your generosity so very much and the opportunity to study with you. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Leora. All right. Well, I hope this time the internet will not cut out as last time. So if it does, I've got a backup plan, but it may be that for a minute or two I'll be gone. All right. And then, of course, we'll start with setting the motivation as usual. And I also like to remind you to pay extra attention to generating a mind that is like a beginner's mind. I've spoken about this before. His Holiness is also, when he guided you through the meditation, if you were there, guided you through the meditation on the second day, spoke about generating a real feeling. So like a real feeling, as in like being deeply moved or being inspired by, for instance, the presence of the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas around us, as like you go through the visualization of the Buddha and so forth. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, to please pay extra attention to this, to visualize everything, go through the prayers, the meditation, everything as if you were to do it for the first time, to do it wholeheartedly. Okay, great. So then let's start. And as usual, we start with some breathing meditation, just to let go of any disruptive thoughts. And then visualize in the space in front of you a manifestation of great compassion and perfect wisdom appearing in the form of the Buddha. Who's inseparable from your Lama. and who's surrounded by the great Nalanda master of India and all the other great Indian masters. Inspiring us and guiding us. And the Buddha is also surrounded by the masters of Tibet, the different traditions. Preserving the Dharma in its pure form. He's also surrounded by the great masters of different traditions in other countries. All of them inseparable from your Lama. With their teachings continuing to guide and inspire us. Just feel their presence right in front of you. And then also think that you're surrounded by all sentient beings. Experiencing numerous different sufferings, mental and physical. All of which is rooted in their misapprehension of reality, the self-grasping. And let's first start with generating affectionate love. That is a feeling of perfection, closeness, and acceptance towards all sentient beings, towards all these beings surrounding us, without exception. Having a feeling of warmth towards all of them. And then paying attention to all the unwanted experiences, their sufferings, their misery. Let's generate great compassion. The wish, may they be free from all their obscurations, all their problems and difficulties. And of course, the causes that give rise to all of those. And may we be able to protect them from their suffering, its causes. The aspiration, may we be able to lead them to a state that's free from all these sufferings. And great compassion then gives way to the special altruistic attitude. Which is the strong resolve. I'll do whatever I can, however long it takes. To help sentient beings to free themselves from the different types of suffering and their causes, especially the root cause of self-grasping. And then, since we only can do so effectively once we become a Buddha ourselves, let's generate bodhicitta, the aspiration or the resolve to become fully enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. And it's also with this resolve that we continue to study Chandrakirti's text. And in preparation for that, recite and meditate on the prayers. Starting with refuge and bodhicitta, to strengthen the mind of enlightenment once again. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the accumulation of merits of practicing generosity and so forth, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. And again, to strengthen our determination, especially love, compassion for sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings never be separated from happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. And specifically directed at the front visualization as inseparable from your Lama. Reverently I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time. And rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence. And turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of others to the great enlightenment. Okay, great. All right, so to continue, well, I didn't receive any questions, and that's fine. In case you do have questions, you can always, of course, send them to Dalit, who very kindly passes them on to me. And if you don't want me to mention your name, then just let me know. Well, I thought for today, actually, first I need to talk about what to do next week. This coming week, actually. Happy New Year, by the way. I forgot. So to first talk about what I would like you to do. As of course, with regard to bodhicitta, if you have attended His Holiness's teachings, then His Holiness has spoken about, of course, the mind of enlightenment in connection to emptiness, this union, this kind of practice of bringing the two together. Now, from that point of view, you have more of the tools now with Chandrakirti's text to apply emptiness, of course, also to bodhicitta. But again, I can only emphasize again and again to continue with this practice. Just even if you feel you've not done such a good job or you have a good job, never mind, what's past is past, just continue doing it. But also, while we're practicing that, again, to continue, or not again, but to continue with the practice we started a few weeks ago. So right now, after having generated a sense of equanimity towards all sentient beings, having spent some time with the possibility of rebirth, or depending on your conviction regarding the subject, definitely having reminded ourselves that our mental continuum goes on from one life to the next. And so since we're so used to just focus on this lifetime, I've asked you to focus more on especially past lifetimes. And of course, on the fact from a Buddhist point of view that we've had any type of worldly relationship with all sentient beings. There's no relationship. We've been in cyclic existence since the beginning of this time. Our mind has been reborn in the state of samsara since the beginning of this time, and there's no relationship we didn't have with sentient beings. And every sentient being has been so close to us at some point in time. If we have a relationship with someone that has done everything for us, has been so kind to us, take that person and possibly multiply the kindness of that person with regard to the closeness we've experienced or the kindness we've received from all sentient beings at some point in time. But then, of course, for this week, also to reflect more on that kindness, and then together with that, the wish to give something back. Although sentient beings don't remember, it's due to ignorance, it's due to the afflictive emotions. We don't remember either. But there's no doubt. And of course, there's probably a voice in the back of your mind, well, they've also been my worst enemy. But as we all know, it doesn't help us spiritually or otherwise to dwell on that. So that is, of course, logically also, that was also the case. But at the same time, they've also been at some point so extremely close to us, and they've sacrificed for our life for us over and over again, and given us, well, have tried to give us whatever we needed and so forth. So therefore, to spend some time just reflecting on what that could be and generate that sense of gratitude towards all sentient beings. Moving, of course, towards then the first step of a feeling of warmth, the feeling of closeness. So gratitude, warm closeness. So we're not generating that mind yet. I mean, we do it every time we generate the motivation, but more actively or more focused, we'll do that in the future. But kind of move your mind towards that first kind of, state of mind of affectionate love by focusing on the fact how kind these beings have been and so forth. And since that may be more difficult, and we still do the equalizing and exchanging stuff for others, and that's much easier to do. We have less of a harder time with that, especially because of past future lives. But because it's difficult, we should specifically, if we've noticed it's difficult, well, kind of reflect on why that would be the case. I mean, why we have such a hard time possibly thinking of the continuation of the mental consciousness, rebirth, and so forth, and with some of the other factors, and possibly overcome that difficulty. And despite the difficulty, as I said, spend this week on focusing on the incredible kindness of all sentient beings and the wish to give something back. So that's for this coming week. And then, as I started to say a few minutes ago, so there are no questions for today. And I thought, well, from what we've covered so far, there's no need to go over much, but at least some questions that are usually asked in that context. Something that whenever I talk about this particular topic, there are at least two questions that come up. So one question is, well, why is it not the mental consciousness? It's really just hearing the reasonings here. Some people feel, well, but there is the main consciousness, there is, or is the main aggregate, the mental consciousness. Some people argue the subtlest mind that is actually the mind that continues on to become the mind of a Buddha. Usually when people hear about it, for the first time, or when they hear about it after they've heard about emptiness, there's the question, why is that not the I? Why is, from a Buddhist point of view, why do the texts not talk about as that being the conventional I? Or not talking about that particular subtlest mind, but about the coarser mind, why is that not the conventional? Why is that not the I that does exist? So that's a question that's often asked. And in answer to that, well, the very subtle mind, well, let's face it, right now it's not present. We are present, we are there. So there's definitely an I that exists, but the subtle mind right now is not active. The I is active, but the subtle mind is not active. Well, then obviously, it couldn't be that. That couldn't be the conventional I. It would mean we only exist at a few times throughout our lives. I mean, at the time of death, we really come into existence because that's when the subtle mind becomes active, or if you do the kind of meditations that leads to the activation of that mind. Therefore, that can't be that mind. Now, the ordinary mental consciousness that's ever present, and I stress here, it's ever present in that even when we're in deep sleep, when we're in certain states while we're fainting or whatever, well, the mental consciousness is always there, even if its object doesn't clearly appear, and we later on don't remember and that we actually were conscious, or its object is just mere blankness or darkness, if you like. But nonetheless, the mental consciousness is always there. But why is that not the person, the existent person? Well, first of all, what is it we're doing here? We're looking at our sense of self, and we're not totally dismissing the worldly sense of an I, the sense of an I that is renowned in the world, that is known to the world. We're not totally dismissing that. The Buddha there's this famous quote, and it's also mentioned in this text here, that the Buddha does not argue with the world, does not debate. He's not saying, I'm dismissing whatever the world accepts, except, of course, with a few exceptions of emptiness and so, or inherent existence. But other than that, when we talk of an I, there is something to that I that can be accepted. And that I does not just refer to the mind. I mean, otherwise, if someone spills, I don't know, some ketchup on you or on your body directly, or smears you or smears you with some dirt or bumps into you, we wouldn't say this person is bumped into me. Therefore, there's a sense I is also connected to the body. And that convention in the world, we're not trying to contradict that. Okay, so it has some validity. No one is saying that is wrong. That's one aspect. Secondly, when we look for the I as like, when we choose that the mental consciousness is the I, the conventional I, that shows we're not satisfied with a merely labeled I. And if we're not satisfied with a merely labeled I, we're looking for an inherent I, okay? Because we want something a little bit more than just that labeled I. Because otherwise we'd just be like, okay, it's the labeled I, no problem. But our feeling tells us there is something more. It's unfortunately a mistaken feeling, but there's a sense, there's something more than just the label on the basis of mind and body. So there must be something more there. And that's why, and it's not just us, also the Svatantrika Madhyamika, they did the same thing, or they do the same thing, as in believing that there is something there, and so they posit the mental consciousness. However, that means the mental consciousness exists inherently, because you look for something inherently there, and that must be the mental consciousness. And then you cannot, you have to posit something. What is that mental? What is the essence of that? It's not its object. It's not its activity. It's not its moment. So again, you need to show the essence of that, because if that exists inherently as that which is found, if that's the conventional I, if we're not satisfied with a mere labeled I, and the mental consciousness is the I, well, it has to exist inherently, because we want something more. Otherwise, we would be satisfied with the merely labeled I. All right, so that's another argument. And so on top of that, if we say, okay, the person is not just the merely labeled I, well, what about inanimate objects? What about a car? You don't have a consciousness for the car. I mean, the car doesn't have a consciousness. So what is the essence of the car? How does the car exist? If the person cannot just be labeled, and it has to be the mental consciousness as an example, well, what about their car? What do you describe as the essence of the car? Is that which is the actual car? All right, so these are just some suggestions. These are just some ideas, if you like. I mean, or questions that people usually ask me. And if you do happen to have that question, hopefully I was able to address it to some degree. Okay. And then, oh, another aspect, of course, that is important is, well, what we're dealing with here, and I'm saying we're not dismissing the ideas of the world, but also what we're looking at is, of course, an I, the existence of which is exaggerated, which then gives rise to the other afflictive emotions. So let's always go back to, I think it's verse 120, when Chandrakirti talks about why we're actually looking for the I, because it's the root cause for self-centeredness giving rise to the other afflictive emotions. So it's that sense. You're still there? Yeah. It's that sense of an I. It's that sense, 120, okay. Let me just scroll up a little further. Oh yeah, there it is. Seeing with their wisdom that all afflictions and all faults stem from the identity view, grasping at the perishable collection, and knowing that self is the focus of this identity view. Okay, so the yoga engages in the negation of selfhood. Therefore, that is what's troubling us. That's the root of all our trouble. It's that sense of I that seems to pervade mind and body. And on the conventional level, it does, of course, it's labeled on the basis of mind and body, or mind or body, depending on the situation. But we just add a little bit more to it. We add more to it. We're not satisfied with that I being merely labeled. It feels there's more to it. And we've never questioned it. We're so used to giving into that. And it plays such a huge part in our everyday life, that I, in the sense that we feel stronger, we have to protect it. And if we just had to protect it, that's not so bad. But we feel we have to gratify it. And as that attachment to the I, feeling it's so important, as that grows stronger, there's a sense its success is more important than any other success. It needs to be successful. It cannot be insulted. That which is mine, my kids, my family, that needs to be better. That needs to be more protected, and so forth, giving rise to this endless these endless aspects of self-cherishing or of self-centeredness. And of course, all the other afflictive emotions. So that's huge. I mean, it really, it's everything. Like, well, Yang Rinpoche talked about this, Wholeness speaks about all the time. Everything in Buddhism really revolves around that. And to pay extra attention to that, to, well, hopefully bring whatever we learn here into our daily life even more, with more of a sense of an urgency. Well, because otherwise we'll just continue on in creating these habits out of this, the sense of this, there is this real I. And so another question that people often ask with regard to this I, because we do hear there is an I that does exist and one that doesn't. Well, what about the collection? Of course, the collection. Why is it not the collection of the aggregates? And here we're not just talking about the assembled, non-assembled. No, the assembled kind of aggregates. Why is it not all of them? And I've also addressed that before. Because otherwise, well, and I guess we could, it's also answered here in the text, but the sense, and that's not really mentioned in here, that whatever the I does, all of mind and body would have to do. So I find that to be a powerful argument, and saying, well, if it's the collection of the car assembled the way we know it, and with that certain configuration, well, then whatever you see the car, you have to see that collection, you have to see all the parts. If one part breaks, all the parts have to break, and so forth. You can no longer say the car's broken just because the engine no longer works. I mean, the wheels are still working. I don't know, the boot of the car is still okay, and still we say the car's broken. So that would mean all the parts would be broken. Anyway, these are oftentimes questions that I ask, and I've mentioned it before, but just to remind ourselves again. And then if we can go to the verse we got to last time. What verse was that? It was 137, wasn't that? 136?
136 included.
Okay, 136 included. Thank you. All right. So And this is still part of the argument. Can it be the collection? Using, of course, the analogy of the chariot and saying that, well, the chariot, of course, unassembled, that would not be the chariot, obviously. And then once it's assembled, you have a certain configuration, you have a certain shape. Wouldn't that be the chariot? And now you're trying to apply this to the self, which of course is difficult. Chandakirti here argues, well, the shape of the self, that actually refers to the body. And so in 136, how can you talk about the shape of the self? That's something totally physical. But then, of course, saying, well, the self and the body in that connected way, why is it not all of them? And as I just mentioned, the reason, one of the reasons being that whatever applies to well, the self has to therefore apply to all the aggregates, and that's obviously not the case. And of course, you're welcome in your questions to argue further from there. But then it tells us in 137, it describes this relationship, appropriator and the appropriated. It's really just saying, well, if the I is all the aggregates, then where is the I as that which owns and that which is owned? So there's no longer a difference between the I and the aggregates, because the I is those aggregates. And although we're not saying the I is totally separate from mind and body, or totally separate from the aggregate, but it's still not the aggregates. It's not them. So there's this middle way between them. Being merely labeled, we say it does exist. It exists and is not identical with the aggregates. Why? Because as a merely labeled entity, we speak of the owner of the aggregates. That merely labeled I is the owner, a merely labeled owner, a conventional owner of course, the merely labeled aggregates either. So the aggregates are merely labeled, the I is merely labeled. And so we say the I is the owner. In fact, the Tibetan term, and I think I've mentioned that before, the Tibetan word for owner is dakpo, and dakpo is the first syllable is da, which is self. It's the same word for self. So the first syllable of the word owner also is the word for self, implying that a self, an I, is the owner of what? Mind and body. And so we speak of the owner and that which is owned. And the word appropriator, that's just a really odd word, but I guess it's the best translation I've seen of the I being described as that which takes on the aggregates. All right. So then you would probably argue, well, the I takes on the aggregates. What does that mean? It's the mind. When we die, like after we've died in the previous life, our mental consciousness left the body of our previous life and then connected to the body of this life. So a new body was appropriated. Now, actually, yes, the mental consciousness goes through this process of connecting to a new body. But based on that, we label I, here mainly on the basis of the mental consciousness, we label the I took on a new body, new aggregates. I mean, new aggregates, new mental aggregates as well, because now with the labeled I having connected, and of course, what's the basis of that labeling? It's the mental consciousness that connected to the body. But having connected to that body, we now label the I took on a human mind and a human body. Because once the mental consciousness is connected to the body, that mental consciousness is now a human mental consciousness with a human body. Therefore, from then onwards, we label I on mind and body, on that entity or on that, well, collection, if you like, of mind and body. Based on that, we now label I. And the I is the appropriator, has appropriated, has taken possession of, if you like, appropriated in the sense of that which has taken possession of the mental, the mind and body, the human mind and body of this lifetime. So in that sense, we talk conventionally of appropriator, that which took possession, and that what was taken, what was appropriated, or that which was taken possession of. But if that I did not exist as different from mind and body, we couldn't talk of appropriator and the appropriated. Okay, so therefore, owner and that which is owned, appropriator and appropriated. We also say the I controls mind and body. Now, of course, really, what do we label the I on when we talk of the I as being a controller? Well, on the mental consciousness, right? We also say the I snores. I snore at night, for instance. In that moment, I labeled the I on the basis of the body. So it just always depends on what is doing what. And what I want to say about this whole entity, mind and body, and so if it's to do with the body, I label on the basis of the body, I snore. If I label it, if it's an activity of the mind, I take the base of imputation is the mind, and then I label I. But other than that labeling I, there is no I to be found. But it doesn't feel that way. It feels like I call it the I because there's something there. So this we need to go back to that again and again. So based on that merely labeled I, we label it with our own mind, we add something to it. We add a little bit more to it, and then we believe, our mind adds more to it, and we then believe it to be there. So what does the text tell us? Well, then it wouldn't make sense to have an appropriator and the appropriated if the I were to be the aggregates. If we now, as part of our analysis, can't find a separate I, so has to be mind and body altogether, we can no longer draw that distinction. So that the appropriator and the appropriated are one is illogical. So I hope it's still clear that this refers to the I being mind and body, the collection of mind and body. For this would mean the object of an act and the agent are the same. And they cannot be the same. It doesn't make sense to say that act and agent are the same. They're labeled on the basis of a difference. So if you think the agent doesn't exist, but the object of the act does, if on top of that you say, oh, well, the self doesn't exist, but there's an act or an object of an act, well, that certainly doesn't make any sense. So there's a conventional I, and there's a conventional, object that is owned by the I, which is mind and body. So if you think the agent doesn't exist, but the object of the act does, that makes it even worse. This is incorrect, for there's no act done without a doer. Therefore, you have to have these different entities, appropriated, and they can never be the same. And there's so many relationships like that between mind and body. But of course, it's as simple as long and short. You can't have long without short. You can't have short without long. What time is it? Oh, we still got time. None of those would make sense. There's a whole list of them. And to take it further from there, so it's not directly related to this verse, but also as part of looking at the I. So as I said earlier on, this is something we can do on a daily basis. We can do all the time. Bring this back to mind. And I think we're getting better at it because, well, as we continue to study the text, hopefully it makes more and more sense to us, and it becomes clear what Chandrakirti is teaching. So the fact that to our mind, the I seems to be separate from mind and body, so it seems to be more than just a labeled I. There seems to be more to it. But let's not forget, when we say I, we keep saying I, but there's more to it. There's so much more to it. Our sense of identity, and that's it. I mean, this self-grasping is just an unrealistic sense of identity. Who am I? Okay, so we think of I, but like I said, there's more to it. We think ourselves as being, I don't know, human. Okay, so human, Israeli or American or German or Indian, whatever. So there's that sense of I'm, let's say, Indian, or I'm a man, I'm a woman, or something else. Or what else? I'm a mother, I'm a child, I'm a daughter, I'm a son, I'm an uncle, I'm a grandparent, and so forth. So we have this, I usually refer to it as a collage, as like a sense of I'm this, and it's all part of the I. It's inseparable. Our sense of I goes along with all these. But again, just as the I is labeled, of course, in dependence on others as well, not just on the dependence on mind and body. The basis of imputation is described as mind and body. That's described as the basis of imputation. But just because we label something in dependence on something else, that other object is not called necessarily the object of imputation, because it's also in dependence on others. Others are not the basis of imputation for labeling I, but it's still, because they're others, I label I, as in like, as opposed to others. I as opposed to others. And the thing is, actually, I easily forget that others are also I, except not from my perspective. From their own perspective, they're also I. And the fact that I believe my own self to be more precious only because this mind here, where I am, this mind labels I and doesn't label I on the basis of another person, well, that doesn't make any sense. Why do I believe the merely labeled I over here is more precious than the merely labeled I over there, which from the perspective of a different mind perceives this other person as the I, and I am other. All right, but just as part of this this analysis, or as part of this reflection, well, I label I on the basis of mind and body. That's my basis of imputation, but also independence on others. And what else do I do? So to complete that sentence. So just as I cannot find an I among others, of course, this I that I label here in dependence on myself, it cannot be found within others, although I do it in dependence on others, and it cannot be found on the basis of imputation, I and body. Well, that shows me it is merely labeled. And in a similar fashion, well, when I label woman on myself and someone else labels man on themselves, it's again, there's a basis of imputation, of course, physical aspects and mental aspects as well, but they're not a man or a woman, these physical or mental aspects. And based on them, I label man or woman. And if I'm a mother or a father, again, I label on the basis of mind and body and on the basis of another being, a child. So it's independence on the child. I call myself father or mother. Can I find some fatherness within me? No. Motherness within me? No, it's merely labeled on the basis of this other person. Grandparent, grandson, granddaughter, all of these are all part of our identity. If you're Israeli, for instance, well, it's based on your passport. Again, of course, it's also your mind and body as your basis of imputation, but that's not sufficient. You have a certain, citizenship, or, well, determined by your parents, or maybe not determined by your parents, depending on the laws of the country. So basically the citizenship, your passport, your whatever. So there's certain aspects, again, there's no Israeliness found in your passport as such, but based on that, we label that, and that's part of the I. And just as the I cannot be found being Israeli or being a man or a woman or a grandfather, none of those can be found as anything other than just imputed on the basis of something else. So just want to stress this. If you do this meditation, it's not extensively described here in the text, it's just implied, but to take your sense, this collage of who you are, of how you identify, or how your the nature of your self-identity. It's like a collage, it's like a collection of I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. But none of those are anything more than labeled. None of them. And that may seem scary. And if it does scare you, that's actually a good type of fear, because she said that in his teachings, if you attended them some weeks ago, he said that's a good kind of fear. It shows we're moving in the right direction. And it's not a kind of fear that will at some point become overwhelming. No, slowly we'll get used to it, and we're able to let go of that fear. And it would rather feel a sense of liberation. It's a bit like when you have your house full with stuff and someone wants to take it away. First you're like, fearful. And then slowly you're able to give it up, and you feel like, oh, good riddance. Oh, that stuff lying around. It's like a burden, when you got a house full with useless stuff. And initially you can't let go. There's even fear that a fire will destroy it. But when you become aware that this is just a burden, then, oh, I'm so glad it's gone. Same. Our sense of self, our wrong sense of I is a burden. It's the greatest burden we have. It's our greatest burden. We carry this imagined I around with us. It's like an imagined I. We carry it around like on our shoulders. We're bent forward, right? Imagining this big I that we need to gratify, we need to protect. That which belongs to it needs to be protected. All our time and energy goes, and we've got no time to have compassion for others. I'm so busy with myself. Others, no, I've got too much to do with my own issues. But these own issues are only projected. All right. Anyway, having said all this, let's continue with the text. I'm sorry, that was a little bit just at the side. All right. Now, here, what we hear with 137, of course, agent, appropriated. I hope that's a little clear now, also in the sense of grandfather, grandchild, and so forth. Now, what does the Buddha tell us? What I just said, that the self is merely labeled. The self is just dependent on these 6 things. So the 4 basic elements: earth, water, fire, wind, adding space to it that comes towards the end. So earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness, and space. There you are. The body aggregate consisting of 4 elements plus space, where space, which is so interesting, space, it's like, I think it's like 99% of our body is made of space. So really, there's really just mainly space there, however solid it seems. But yeah, well, we were made of mainly space. So Lama Tsongkhapa says in his commentary, I think he says the space in the nostrils, but there's so much more space we're made of course. Scientifically now we know that. So there's earth, water, fire, wind, and space. This is actually a quote given from the meeting of the Mother and Father Sutra. And if you're familiar with Ratnavali or Nagarjuna's precious garland, he says something very similar. He says the person is not earth, not water, not fire, not wind, not space, not consciousness, not all of them together. What person is there other than these? So here saying the person, the inherent person, is none of those, but of course the person is merely labeled. So in Ratnavali, in Nagarjuna's Ratnavali or precious garland, he's saying what the person isn't. He's negating the part that we just imagine. And here, this is the part that actually does exist, that's described in this verse. So the Buddha is saying that the self is merely labeled on the basis of body and mind, or body or mind. It's almost better to say body or mind, because it's not always labeled. I mean, not each moment of I, like I said earlier, is always labeled on both mind and body. If only the body does something, I label I on the basis of the I, of the body. If someone, I don't know, smears me with color, I say I on the basis of my body being smeared by color. So it's just the body in that moment. And other times, if I meditate, it's only the it's only the mind that's meditating. So I label I only on the basis of the mind. So therefore, it's better to say the I is labeled on mind or body. It can, of course, also be labeled on both. So earth, water, fire, wind, consciousness, and space. And also on the 6 sense faculties of the eyes and so forth, which are in turn the basis for contact. So what is this? What is it telling us? The first 2 lines are pretty clear. So he's saying, okay, he's really saying, in other words, the I is merely labeled, it's dependent, it's labeled, it's existent in dependence on being labeled on the basis on the four elements that are part of the body and consciousness. And then what is this? The 6 sense faculties of the eyes and so forth, which are in turn the basis for contact. Well, here it's saying, of course, the 6 sense faculties are part of mind and body. The 5 sense faculties, eye sense faculty and so forth, and then the mental sense faculty, the 6th faculty. But of course, this is what allows us to make contact with other objects. So objects with the outside world, which we need to generate a sense of self. So a conventional sense of self is built in dependence on our relationship with other objects, with our contact with the outside world. And it's therefore the person is merely labeled on all the sense faculties we need, which make contact with these objects, which then allow for us to relate to the world, and based on that, generate our conventional sense of an I, our sense identity. That is so important. Of course, it's really important. And the Buddha does not argue with the world about that. That is important. The problem is we add too much to it. That's it. Okay. And then it goes on to say, he also said, the Buddha also said, this is verse 139, he also said the self is conceived on the basis of mind and mental factors. So not just, of course, on mind and body in general, as said in verse 138, the first 2 lines, and then on the physical sense faculties as well as the mental sense faculty, and then giving rise to contact, one of the mental factors, but on the basis of all the minds and mental factors, the different types of mind, different mental factors. Therefore, self is neither identical to any of these factors, nor is it their mere collection. Thus, the thought I does not grasp any of these. Okay, it's based on these, of course, but it's neither one with them nor identical with them. And with that, so far, what have we analyzed of the 7 extremes, the 7 extreme ways that were analyzed here? How many have been analyzed of them? You can raise your fingers and show me on the screen. Oh, let me just make sure I see all of you. How many have been analyzed so far? Can I see a show of hand? Okay. 5 or 4? 5. Okay, I see 5. All right. Leora is not clear. Indeterminate. 4. Okay, 4. All right. What's the 5th one? I'm wondering. Because actually, I mean, as far as I know, we've mainly analyzed. Is it the same as the aggregates? Is it different from the aggregates, the I? Is it the collection or the shape? All right, those are the 4 extremes we've gone through. So shape, of course, doesn't really make sense in the context of the I, and we've gone through this. But there's another way in which we assume an inherent I, an I that exists beyond just being labeled, which is then dependent on the aggregates, or the aggregates being dependent on such an I, or such an independent kind of inherent I being the owner of the aggregates. And I'm not saying a conventional. Yeah, when I say the I is the owner, of course, I'm saying the conventional I. But here the extreme would be it's that I that appears extra, that seems to be extra here. And if we can go back to the verses. If you can go back, yeah, thank you. So you say, oh, sorry, this is actually not. Oh, I'm a little ahead. I forgot those 2 verses in between. Before we'll move to the other extremes that I just mentioned. Those are the 3. There are 2 verses before that. So 130. Okay, 139, I think, is clear. Okay, just saying 138 and 139 are just saying, how does the self exist? It's merely labeled on the basis of those mentioned. Now, as we've heard early on, there was this person, one of the Vaibhashikas, one of the sub-schools of the Vaibhashika, the Samityas, and they'll be mentioned again later. they're the ones that do say they definitely assert inherent existence, are definitely all for it, as all the other schools except the Prasangika is, but they deny, as the other schools do, a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. But they say that actually when you deny the self, it's an eternal I, it's an eternal self. Remember, there was this whole argument, like, is the I the aggregates or not? So what do you, when you refute the I, when you negate the I, what are you negating? And someone is saying it's the permanent I, it's the eternal I. So going back to that argument, saying that when you realize selflessness, what you have to realize is an eternal I. So this is what one person says, but other people would say, well, self-sufficient, substantially existent self. So other than the Prasangika, none of them suggest that an inherent I has to be negated. All of them say something has to be negated, either an eternal self as here, or as the other schools other than the Samkhya would say, well, a self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Actually, the Samkhyas would have to assert that as well, which becomes clear in the argument a little later. But anyway, the point is here, well, yeah, the second line, actually. So the Samkhya say it's only the eternal self that is negated here. And that's what Chandrakirti addresses. He says, you, Samkhya's, you're saying that's the eternal self that is negated when no self is realized, when you realize selflessness, which we need to do in order to overcome self-centeredness. Yet you do not consider that to be the basis of I grasping. Oh, here it becomes clear. But you see, on the other hand, well, the basis for I grasping is not the eternal self. It's at least a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. As all the other non-Prasangikas would say, that's the basis that gives rise to all the afflictive emotions. So that's not consistent. You're talking about the eternal self needs to be negated, but that's not the main cause for the other afflictive emotions. So you claim that the knowledge of no self definitely eradicates the view of self is most astounding indeed, because according to you, you only need to get rid of the sense of an eternal, an unchanging self, but not of anything else, because that was what the other person argued earlier on. This argument is not, it's not that important to say eternal. It can be applied to anything. When we say what needs to be negated is a permanent I or self-sufficient substantial I, but not more, well, we're in trouble, because we're still holding on to an I that doesn't exist the way it appears. We're not negating enough, and we won't be able to overcome afflictive emotions. And so in this case, it's specifically taking the Samkhya, saying, well, if it's an eternal I to you, but you don't say that the eternal I is really the troublemaker or the misperception, well, that's really weird. And he's giving this example. This is like a man who's seeing a snake in the cracks of his wall, seeks to clear the doubt about whether there's an elephant in the room, hoping thereby to remove his fear of the snake. Alas, I think you say alas. He will be an object of ridicule by others. Oh, well, he'll be an object. So really the story is this, that there's a man who's got a crack in his walls. And of course, that's a typical, well, ancient Indian example where you have, well, depending in the heat of the plains of India, you have snakes actually, and you have elephants as well. But there's a crack in your wall, and there's the fear seeing a snake there. So there's fear that there is a snake in your wall, and another person, actually, according to the commentaries. So it's not really this man himself, but it's another person seeking to clear the doubt by saying, oh, don't worry, there's no elephant. So basically here, the snake in the wall, holding on to the snake, or the fear of the snake in the wall, that's like the subtlest self-grasping. And the fear of an elephant, that's a coarse self-grasping. Now, if you're fearful of the subtler, like the crack of the wall, if someone comes along and tells you, well, there's no elephant, or in this case, if I'm troubled by the projection, by the misapprehension of an inherent I, and someone tells me, oh, don't worry, there's no eternal I, there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent I, well, my troubles have not been resolved because I'm still, I mean, someone telling me, as in like someone showing me how to negate a courses kind of I, as in like someone telling me there's no elephant in the room, well, that won't help me. It'll help to some degree, but it'd be ridiculous to believe we can be liberated. So this is actually an argument that comes up at the very beginning of this text. It's like the 3 types of reasonings that are considered to be really important, and we haven't really gone through them because in the root text they're not explicitly mentioned. Plus, it's much more material for someone who debates, and you understood these reasonings already, actually. One other reason is you also need to be really familiar with the lower school. So when we study Madhyamika, we studied previous to that a few years of course, Paramita, the Paramita Sutras or Pachin. And as part of that, we've learned about the other schools. And we're very familiar with this idea that the other schools say, in order to overcome afflictive emotions, all you need to realize is that there's no eternal I, that there's no self-sufficient, substantially existent I. That's sufficient. The I exists inherently. In the Prasangika school saying, that's not enough. That's like trying to get rid of the fear of a snake in the cracks of your wall by understanding there's no elephant. Okay, you won't get rid of that. So just understanding there's no elephant doesn't overcome that that fear of the snake. So likewise, to overcome self-grasping, that deepest level, you need to realize selflessness. And in the lower schools, they say, for instance, that an arhat, for instance, the Svatantrika Madhyamika school, they argue that an arhat needs to only realize this core selflessness, a lack of a self-sufficient, substantially existent I, and only a bodhisattva needs to realize emptiness, which is still not the lack of inherent existence, but it's the lack of true existence, the lack of phenomena existing independent of appearing to the mind, to put it simply. So only a bodhisattva needs to realize emptiness, and an arhat, a hero, a solitary realizer, needs to realize needs to realize selflessness. And the Prasangika, they deny that. They say, no way. If you say that, then that means an arhat still has afflictive emotions, because the root cause will still continue to give rise to the afflictive emotions. So it would absurdly follow that an arhat still has afflictive emotions. That's one of the reasonings. The second reasoning, I don't remember now. What was the second reasoning? That there is that the arhat would still have afflictive emotions. They're very simple. I just don't remember right now. The third is that the arhat would still hold on to his aggregates, his or her aggregates, as inherently as existing the way they appear, because you only dealt with the I and you haven't dealt with phenomena other than the I. And I'll remember in a moment the second one. But the point is, these 3 reasons, I mean, they're pretty obvious to us. Actually, they're not that difficult, but you studied them because of the logical statements, the way they're stated. Is this a logical consequence? How do you realize this, and so forth? So this is not something you've learned as part of the debate, as part of having studied the Pramanavartika, which is why I didn't go into them that much. And like I said, they're easily explained, but when you debate it, you can kind of debate on the kind of logical statements, the way they're set forth. All right. Anyway, I just remembered this right now, but I want to not go back to that. I want to focus mainly on 141 and 140 before that. So hopefully that's clear, that it's not enough to refute a certain type of I, as I just mentioned. So to summarize them, that would be like telling someone there's no elephant in the room when really they're scared of a snake in the cracks of their wall. Okay, so that would be ridiculous. We need to get down to the subtlest type of self when it comes to the misapprehension. Okay, and then verse 142, and you see I'll go a little bit faster through these verses because we spent quite a bit of time on them, and I think it's clear as far as I can tell. If not, just send a question to the delete, explain verse 139 or whatever we've gone through again. I'll be happy to do that. But for now, I'll move on to verse 142. The self does not exist in the aggregate. So here we go. There is no, and these are the other three extremes that we haven't addressed yet. The self does not exist in the aggregates, as in like the self as it appears to us, an inherent I, does not exist in the aggregates as being dependent on the aggregates, nor do the aggregates exist in the I as the self does not exist in the as being dependent on the aggregates, nor do the aggregates exist in the self as being dependent on the self. And again, I need to stress here, of course, we're not talking about a conventional I. There, the dependence is given both ways. The self is dependent on the aggregates are dependent on the self, yes, but that's only the case for the merely labeled I. Here we're speaking of a totally separate I. If there was that dependence, if the self existed, if there was an inherent self, so the self, the way it appears to us, if that were to exist in such a manner that it was somehow in the aggregates, we do get a sense it's in the aggregates, somewhere within the aggregates, and it depends on the aggregates. Our mind is able to deal with these contradictions. I mean, we can make both work. Oh yeah, there's an inherent I and it depends on the aggregates. I mean, we're good with contradictions, no problem. But if that really were the case, if such a self really existed, let's take hypothetically, then the self would be totally separate from the aggregates. In the same way as, why totally separate? Well, if such an inherent I existed, as we've heard, either it's one with the aggregates or it's separate from the aggregates. If it's one with the aggregates, this dependence couldn't happen. You can't have that which is dependent and the dependee being one. It would be like, well, like two objects that are totally separate. For instance, if you have a bowl of water and you have a bowl and you have water, and when you add the water into the bowl, for that water to remain in the bowl, it depends on the bowl of water. So it depends on that bowl. And so they're separate. They're not one, they're separate. They're separate objects. Their existence is in that moment dependent on each other, but they don't have the same relationship as the conventional I and the aggregates. One is not a part of the other, in other words. So if the aggregates were to exist inherently within the I, or if the I were to exist inherently within the aggregates, if the inherent I were to exist within the aggregates, they would have to be totally separate, like a bowl and water kind of putting them together. And of course, we've already seen that's impossible. So that would therefore, if that were given here, would lead to the extreme that the I existed totally separate from the aggregates, nor do the aggregates exist in that inherent I. And again, when we have a sense of an I, we sometimes have a sense, if we think about how does the I exist, right? If you really reflect on it, like the inherent I as it appears, it connects to the aggregates. So there's a sense somehow the aggregates are dependent on the I and the I is dependent on them, or within one or the other. The self exists within the aggregates as like an inherent I, and an inherent and the aggregates, the inherent I exists in the aggregates, and the aggregates exist in the inherent I. Both, we can think of both in a way. We make it work, although logically it doesn't make sense. But if they were separate, and that's what line 3 tells us, so if that would mean they were separate, and if they were separate, such notions might be plausible only then. But since they're not different, these notions are mere concepts. They're mere concepts in the sense of unrealistic mental constructions. And then the seventh extreme. So this is, we have 4 extreme views covered before. 1 different collection and shape. And now we've had inherent I dependent on, or aggregates dependent on the inherent I. We had that relationship. No, I should say that again. I didn't say that clearly. An inherent I dependent on the aggregates, the aggregates depending on an inherent I, and then there's one more left. The inherent I owns the aggregate, but the self cannot be said. An inherent I cannot own the aggregate of form and the other one, since the self does not exist. Such an inherent self doesn't exist, so such ownership is meaningless. One owns a cow through difference or a body through inherence. The self is neither identical, true, nor different from the body. Okay. All right. Anyway, let's leave it at that. I'll go through 143 again next time. I've done it a little bit faster, but I think it's better to leave it at this now. We'll do a meditation now. I would like to do a meditation not specifically on what we just read, because it'll be more expensively explained in later verses. So we still have time to meditate on that. But what I would like you to do today is to meditate on this sense of identity. So you get a sense again, to look for a sense of being a woman, a sense for being a man, that sense of identity, to look for that, and understand instead that this identity is merely labeled in the way I described it, and the way we'll go through it in the meditation as well. And of course, as I've said many times, to try and generate a special feeling. So as if you were to do it for the first time, generate that beginner's mind, but also, I don't know, I don't really know how to put it into words when I say a special feeling, but being moved in a special sense that even if it's fake, never mind, you start off with, well, fake it until you make it kind of idea. So even if it's initially fake, but to go through this notion of I can't find the I, this is not it, and allow for this to go deeper, especially at the point when I ask you to focus on your inside, to really take it to that emotional kind of level that affects you deeper, affects your mind on a deeper level. All right, so let's start now. And of course, again, with breathing meditation, please make an extra effort, of course, with that, just because your mind is full from me talking for so long. Okay, so we'll start with breathing meditation. And so now, once again, turn your attention to your I. To your sense of self. Of who you are. Of an I that you feel you have to protect, gratify, and satisfy. Does that seem to be merely labeled? Or is there a sense there's much more to it? But since we don't just think ourselves as being I, we also think of a sense of having a certain nationality, specific gender. Try to get in touch with that feeling of being inherent Israeli or inherent male, female, and so forth. Is there a sense you're not merely labeled a man or a woman, but more than that? How about your sense of being a parent or son or daughter? Get in touch with this sense of inherently being a teacher, a student, a parent, and so forth. Anything that is part of the collage of who you are. Self-identity. Is there a sense those are just labels? There's much more beyond the label or the labels. Yet where would that be? Where would that womanness or manness, where would that be? Your sense of nationality. Is it one with your mind and body or separate from them? Can that be found within your body or somewhere within your mind? Can you pinpoint them? Spend a moment just remaining with that non-findability of the I, but also of being son or daughter, man or woman, Israeli, or of any other nationality. Yet that doesn't mean that they're non-existent if you don't find them to exist inherently. The I is labeled in dependence on mind and body, and in dependence on others. Being being a man or woman is merely labeled on certain physical aspects as well as certain mental preferences, states of mind, and so forth. Dependence on a child or a merely labeled parent. And in dependence on our parents, we are merely labeled son or daughter. In dependence on an employee, we are employed. And dependence on those we employ, we're an employee. There's not a single aspect of the collage of our sense of I, or identity, that is not merely labeled. It depends on other factors. So there's no inherent I that, like a burden, needs to be protected, gratified, and so forth, other than a merely labeled I. And so now, whatever insight that you've gained through this short analysis, generate single-pointed, apply single-pointed meditation to specifically focus on that and allow for it to sink deeper and move you on a deeper level. And so finally, let's dedicate whatever virtue we've accumulated today. May this, of course, lengthen the life of our spiritual masters like His Holiness Dalai Lama, Jadaruchi, and so forth. And may it become a cause for us to eventually reach the enlightened state of a Buddha. Even right now, help us to deal better with our daily problems, daily challenges. And also affect others around us, those we're connected to directly or indirectly. To overcome sickness, like in the case of Tali Lubin. Overcome worry, fear, depression, and all the other numerous problems, countless problems of this world. And of course, in the way Shantideva describes them in his prayer. May all beings everywhere, plagued by sufferings of body and mind, attain an ocean of happiness and joy by virtue of my merits. May no living creature suffer, commit evil, or ever fall ill. May no one be afraid or belittled with a mind weighed down by depression. May the blind see forms and the deaf hear sounds. May those whose bodies are worn with toil be restored on finding repose. May the naked find clothing, the hungry find food. May the thirsty find water and delicious drinks. May the poor find wealth, those weak with sorrow find joy. May the forlorn find hope, constant happiness and prosperity. May there be timely rains and bountiful harvests. May all medicines be effective and wholesome prayers bear fruit. May all who are sick and ill quickly be freed from their ailments. Whatever diseases there are in the world, may they never occur again. May the frightened cease to be afraid, and those bound be freed. May the powerless find power, and may people think of benefiting each other. Most importantly, for as long as space remains, for as long as sentient beings remain, until then, may I too remain to dispel the miseries of the world. Okay, great. So just to remind you for this coming week, of course, mainly generate bodhicitta again and again and again. And as of course, early in the morning, like His Holiness, first thing you wake up, bodhicitta. But then also to go through the practice, to do the practice of, well, the fact that all sentient beings have been at some point so extremely close, have given us so much support, have benefited us in so many ways, to bring that to mind and generate the sense of gratitude and the wish to give something back as part of moving closer towards affectionate love towards all sentient beings. And to make sure that the meditation we just did now bears some fruit, has some effect. Well, what you've gone through in this meditative setting, when you find yourself in a situation, conflict with other people, a strong sense of you need to defend yourself or feeling insulted, whenever self-grasping or self-centeredness, self-cherishing becomes an issue, well, bring back what you've just gone through. Look for that I. What is the I? Is it had as a mother, as a woman, as a man? And so in that way, to apply this directly in certain situations and make it hopefully in that way even more effective. All right, time is up. Okay, so wish you a good week. Be safe, and then I see you again next week.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Geshe-ma. Good night.
Bye. Good
Thank you
night.
very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you, Geshe-ma. Thank you, everybody.